Elizabeth Carter did not cry when her husband announced in front of 200 wedding guests that their marriage had been a wager. She did not tremble. She did not look away. She reached up slowly, removed the ivory gloves from her hands, one finger at a time, set them on the banquet table as if she were setting down every expectation she had ever carried, and looked directly at Nathaniel Harrington with eyes so steady that the laughter in the room died before it fully began. If you're new here, please subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The morning Elizabeth Carter became Mrs. Nathaniel Harrington was the most beautiful morning Virginia had seen in 7 summers. She knew that because 3 different guests said so before she had even taken her seat at the dressing table. Her mother's housemaid, old Agnes, had pressed her gown herself. Ivory silk, high-waisted in the fashion of the year, with small pearl buttons running from the base of her spine to the nape of her neck. Her younger sister Clara had woven white ribbon into Elizabeth's dark hair and stood back with tears already gathering, saying it wasn't fair that a person could be both sensible and beautiful at the same time, and why didn't Providence spread those gifts around more evenly? Elizabeth had laughed at that. She had laughed easily that morning, which was not always her nature. She was by most accounts a composed woman, thoughtful, before she spoke slow, to give her trust quick, to notice the details that other people walked past without seeing. But that morning, she had felt something loosening inside her chest. Something like possibility. She was 26 years old. She had watched 3 of her closest friends marry and begin building their lives. She had managed her father's household accounts since she was 19, had read every agricultural pamphlet that came through Fredericksburg, had sat at more dinner tables than she could count, listening to men debate the management of land they understood only on paper. She had opinions. She had plans. And now finally, she had a marriage to a man who was by every external measure the most desirable match in 3 counties. Nathaniel Harrington was 34. His family had held Harrington Crossing for 4 generations. The main house sat on 1,200 acres of working farmland outside Charlottesville, and the man himself was the kind of tall, sharp-featured, self-assured Virginian that made other men straighten their spines when he walked into a room. He was not warm exactly. Elizabeth had noticed that during their courtship, the way he spoke to servants without looking at them, the way he listened to her with what felt more like assessment than interest. But she had told herself that reserve was not the same as coldness. That a man who had inherited serious responsibility at a young age was entitled to carry himself seriously. She had told herself a great many things. The ceremony itself was held in the Harrington Ballroom, which had been converted for the occasion with more flowers than Elizabeth had ever seen gathered in one interior space. White roses, gardenias, lengths of pale green ribbon that the Harrington housekeeper, Mrs. Aldridge, had apparently spent 2 weeks arranging. There were 200 guests, landowners, merchants, judges, the kind of Virginian society that measured its own importance by the weight of its silver and the acreage of its holdings. Elizabeth's family occupied 3 rows on the left. They were respected people comfortably established, but they did not own 1,200 acres, and Elizabeth had been aware quietly, without making too much of it, that some of Nathaniel's circle found the match slightly beneath him. She had not let that trouble her. She was not a woman who let other people's assessments determine her worth. The vows were spoken clearly. Nathaniel's voice was steady, his eyes on hers, and if there was something behind his expression that Elizabeth could not quite read, she set it aside. A new life required a certain willingness to step into the unknown. She understood that. The celebration began. The dining room was filled with the sound of silverware and conversation, and the occasional burst of laughter from the men gathered near the windows. Elizabeth moved through it with her mother at her elbow for the first hour, receiving congratulations, answering the same 3 questions. Are you happy? When will you settle into the crossing? What do you think of the new house, with the same patient smile? Nathaniel moved through the room separately. He was a man who worked a crowd like a field methodically without wasted motion. She caught his eye twice across the room. He nodded both times. She told herself that was enough. Then the toasting hour arrived. Nathaniel's closest friend, a broad-shouldered man named Marcus Webb, who owned the neighboring property and who had. Elizabeth had noticed a particular way of looking at her that she could not name, but did not entirely like. Marcus Webb stood and raised his glass, and said that before the groom offered his toast, he wanted to say a few words about how this marriage had come about. Elizabeth set down her fork. There was something in the room that shifted. She felt it before she could explain it. A kind of held breath. A few of the men near Marcus were smiling in a way that didn't match the occasion, too knowing, too private, like men sharing a joke. The room hadn't been let in on yet. "Nathaniel here made a claim," Marcus said, addressing the room with the easy confidence of a man who enjoyed a captive audience. "Back in February at my card table," he said, and I want to quote this accurately because we did write it down. He said that any woman in Virginia, no matter how proud her family or how high her opinion of herself, could be convinced to marry him inside of 6 months. If he could name her himself. The laughter that came was uncertain at first. Scattered. Men who weren't sure whether they should be laughing yet. "He named Miss Elizabeth Carter," Marcus continued. "Eldest daughter of the Carter family of Fredericksburg. Known for her excellent sense and her, shall we say, pointed opinions on the subject of what a man ought to be." More laughter. Looser now. Building. Elizabeth did not move. She was aware of her mother beside her, gone very still. She was aware of Clara across the table, whose face had drained of color. She was aware of the 200 people in that room, some of whom were laughing, and some of whom were looking at the tablecloth, and some of whom, the cruelest ones she would think later, were watching her face with open curiosity, wanting to see what she would do. She was aware of all of it, and she did not move. Nathaniel stood. He raised his glass, and he looked at Elizabeth across the table, and something in his expression was difficult to read. Not quite triumph, not quite apology. Something that lived uncomfortably between the two, and he said, "To my wife, who proved, as I suspected she would, that every woman has her price, even the proudest ones." The laughter came fully then, not from everyone, but from enough. Elizabeth reached up and removed her right glove. She did it slowly, deliberately, one finger at a time, then the left. She folded them both and set them beside her plate, with the particular care of a woman setting something down that she intended never to pick up again. She looked at Nathaniel, who was still smiling, still holding his glass, still performing, she realized, because that was what this was. A performance. She was the prop. The 200 guests were the audience. And the story he was telling was the story of a man so powerful that even a woman who should have known better had not been able to resist him. She let him hold that smile for 3 full seconds. Then she said clearly enough that the nearest tables heard every word, "Congratulations, Mr. Harrington. You have won your wager, but I want you to understand something before this evening goes any further." The laughter stopped. "I was aware," she said, "that your interest in me was not entirely what you represented it to be." Nathaniel's smile flickered. "My father's business partner, Mr. Henley, sat at that card table in February. He is a discreet man, but he is not a man who can carry guilt easily. He told me in March what was said. He thought I deserved to know." The room was completely silent now. "I chose to proceed with this marriage," Elizabeth said, "not because I was convinced, and not because I was foolish. I proceeded because I believed, and I still believe, that a man can be more than the worst thing he has ever done. I married you because I thought you were worth the risk." She picked up her own glass. "I may have been wrong about that, but I was not deceived, and I am not broken, and I would like your guests to understand that before they finish laughing." She raised her glass to the room and drank. The silence that followed was the kind that reshapes a gathering. Men who had been leaning toward each other with smiles straightened in their chairs. Women who had been pretending not to watch looked away. Marcus Webb set down his own glass and seemed to find something extremely interesting to study in the middle distance. Nathaniel stood very still. He had not expected this. That was the first thing Elizabeth had understood about her husband on the day she agreed to marry him, and it remained true. Now he had never once genuinely expected her. She did not make a scene that evening. She had no interest in scenes. She accepted congratulations from the guests who approached her afterward with the quiet grace of a woman who had decided that dignity was not a thing she was willing to surrender regardless of circumstance. She spoke to Nathaniel's mother, a thin, watchful woman named Mrs. Eleanor Harrington, who took Elizabeth's hand in both of hers and said nothing at all for a moment. just looked at her with an expression Elizabeth couldn't fully decipher, and then said very quietly, "You are not what I expected, my dear." "I rarely am," Elizabeth said. Mrs. Harrington almost smiled. Her own mother found her near the far end of the dining room as the evening wound toward its close and gripped her arm and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "Elizabeth, we can go home. Your father will—" "I'm all right, Mama." "You are not all right. What that man did—" "I know what he did." Elizabeth kept her voice even. "And I know what I am doing. Please trust me." Her mother looked at her for a long moment, with the particular expression of a woman who loves someone and is frightened for them and knows that fear will not change anything. "You have always been the steadiest of my children," her mother said finally. "I just hope to God steady is enough for what you're walking into." Elizabeth squeezed her hand. "So do I, Mama." Harrington Crossing was 40 minutes by carriage from the estate where the wedding had been held, and Elizabeth spent those 40 minutes beside her new husband in a silence that had several different layers to it. Nathaniel broke it first. "I suppose you expect an apology," he said. "I expect nothing from you, Mr. Harrington. That is the safest position I can take at present." "You made quite a speech. You gave me the occasion for it." He turned to look at her. In the low light of the carriage lantern, his face was harder to read than usual. "You knew," he said. "Since March." "Yes." "And you still—" "I did." "Why?" She turned and met his eyes directly. "Because the wager told me one thing about you, Mr. Harrington. But the 4 months of courtship that followed told me several others. You are not a kind man by habit, but I do not think you are a cruel one by nature. I thought that distance was worth crossing." She paused. "I am less certain of that tonight than I was this morning, but I have not yet given up the belief entirely." He said nothing. She looked back at the dark road unwinding ahead of them. "I am going to be honest with you because I find dishonesty exhausting and life is too short for it. I did not marry you for your land or your name or your money. I married you because I thought that underneath the performance you were putting on for Virginia society, there was a man who might actually want to be better than he was behaving. I could be wrong, but I intend to find out." Nathaniel Harrington was not a man who was often at a loss for words. He had built a portion of his reputation on the ease with which he commanded a room, a conversation, a negotiation. But he sat beside his wife in that carriage for the rest of the journey to Harrington Crossing, without speaking another word, and Elizabeth chose to take that as something, though she could not have said exactly what. What she had not prepared herself for was the room. Mrs. Aldridge, the housekeeper, met them at the door with a candle and a careful expression, and led Elizabeth through the main house with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had learned not to invite questions about her employer's decisions. The main house was large and well furnished in the prosperous, slightly austere style of old Virginia families. Good wood, serious portraits, the particular smell of beeswax and old paper. Elizabeth noticed everything. She had always noticed everything. Mrs. Aldridge led her up the main staircase down the wide corridor that she would later learn housed the best bedrooms, past 3 closed doors, and then up a narrower staircase at the corridor's end, to a small room in the east wing that was furnished with a bed, a washstand, a single chair, and a window that looked out over the kitchen garden. "This is the guest room," Elizabeth said. "Mr. Harrington's instructions, ma'am," Mrs. Aldridge said, and there was something in the older woman's voice, not quite apology, not quite embarrassment, that told Elizabeth the housekeeper was not comfortable with the arrangement, but had not been given a choice about it. "I see." Elizabeth stood in the center of the room and looked at it carefully. Small, plain, clean enough, but with the particular blankness of a room that had not been prepared for an actual person. No flowers, no special linens. The kind of accommodation you offered someone you wanted to remind of their place. "Will there be anything you need, ma'am?" Mrs. Aldridge asked. "Hot water in the morning, please. And I'll want to speak with you about the household accounts at your earliest convenience. Tomorrow afternoon, if that works." The housekeeper blinked. "The household accounts?" "Yes. I'd like to understand how things have been run. I won't make any immediate changes. I never believe in changing things I don't yet understand. But I'd like to begin learning." A long pause. "Of course, ma'am. Tomorrow afternoon." "Thank you, Mrs. Aldridge." Elizabeth set her travel bag on the chair. That will be all for tonight. After the door closed, Elizabeth sat on the edge of the bed and was quiet for a long moment. She had known in an abstract way that this marriage would not be easy. She had known Nathaniel Harrington was a man who believed that ownership and authority were the same thing, and that a woman brought into his household would be expected to understand her position within it. She had known the room might be cold, and the welcome non-existent, and the first weeks full of small cruelties dressed up as practicality. She had known all of it. But knowing a thing and living inside it were different experiences, and Elizabeth Carter. Mrs. Harrington now, whether either of them liked it, allowed herself precisely 15 minutes of sitting in the dark of that small room and feeling the full weight of what she had walked into. Then she stood up. She unpacked her bag with the systematic efficiency of a woman who had learned to make order out of whatever space she was given. She set her books on the windowsill. She arranged her writing materials on the washstand. She hung her second dress on the peg behind the door. She was not going to be diminished by a room. Morning came early at Harrington Crossing. Elizabeth was already awake when the household began to stir. She had always been an early riser, a habit from years of managing her father's house, where the early hours were the only quiet ones. She dressed herself since no maid had been assigned to her and went downstairs to find the household at work. What she found stopped her in the doorway of the kitchen. A young man. He couldn't have been more than 17, was standing at the work table, with one arm held carefully against his chest, wrapping a cloth around what was clearly a badly burned hand. He was doing it himself alone, and his jaw was set with the particular stubbornness of someone trying not to show that he was in pain. "Let me see that," Elizabeth said. He looked up, startled. He had clearly not heard her come in. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to be in here. I'm not concerned about where you are. I'm concerned about that hand. Let me see it." He hesitated the way people hesitate when they're not accustomed to being offered help. Uncertain whether it's real, uncertain whether accepting it will cost them something. "It's all right," Elizabeth said more quietly. "I know something about burns. My sister was forever pulling things off the stove too fast." He extended his hand. The burn was significant, a wide stripe across the palm and the base of 2 fingers, the kind that came from grabbing something hot without thinking. Recent and raw. "What happened?" she asked, beginning to unwind what he had managed and examining the injury properly. "Moved a piece of iron that wasn't cooled yet, ma'am. My own fault." "Does Mr. Harrington have a medical kit?" A pause. "He doesn't like the house staff using the supplies unless it's serious, ma'am." Elizabeth looked up at him. "This is serious. What's your name?" "Thomas, ma'am. I work in the stables mostly. I was just helping in the kitchen this morning because—" "Thomas, I am going to get the medical supplies, and I am going to treat that hand properly, and if anyone asks you about it, you may tell them that Mrs. Harrington gave the order. Is that all right?" The boy looked at her with an expression she had not yet learned to name, but would come to recognize over the following weeks, a kind of carefully guarded astonishment, the look of someone who has concluded that good things don't happen to them and is trying to recalibrate in real time. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She found the medical kit in the housekeeper's room over Mrs. Aldridge's quiet and careful protest that Mr. Harrington liked to be consulted before estate supplies were used for staff. "I appreciate that," Elizabeth said, "and I will speak with Mr. Harrington about it. But the boy's hand needs treating now, not after a consultation." Mrs. Aldridge watched her for a moment. Then she handed over the kit without another word. By the time Nathaniel Harrington appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn there by some account from one of the household, Elizabeth suspected she had Thomas's hand properly cleaned, treated and wrapped, and the boy was sitting at the work table eating a biscuit and looking considerably less gray around the edges than he had an hour ago. Nathaniel looked at the scene. He looked at his wife. His expression was difficult to read. "Mrs. Harrington," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Harrington. I understand you've been making use of the household's medical supplies." "I have. One of your stable hands burned his hand badly enough that leaving it untreated would have risked infection and likely cost you several weeks of his work. It seemed inefficient to delay." A beat. "It is the custom here," Nathaniel said, "for household decisions to go through me." "I understand that," Elizabeth said. "I'll remember it in future. though I'd ask you to consider that some decisions need to be made before there is time for consultation. An injured man is one of them." Thomas had gone very still on his stool, the biscuit frozen halfway to his mouth. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He looked at Thomas. He looked at his wife. He looked at the wrapped hand. "See that he gets the rest of the morning," he said finally. "The stables can manage without him until afternoon." He turned and left. Thomas let out a breath that had clearly been held for some time. "Is he always like that?" Elizabeth asked quietly. "Like what, ma'am?" "Like a man who's deciding whether to be angry and opts for the last possible alternative." Thomas looked at her, surprised into something close to a smile. "I reckon that's about the most accurate description I've heard, ma'am." Elizabeth wiped her hands on a clean cloth. "Right then, finish your biscuit." She met with Mrs. Aldridge that afternoon, as agreed, in the small room off the main corridor that served as the housekeeper's office. The accounts were in a leather-bound ledger, and Elizabeth took her time with them, reading carefully, asking questions, writing notes in the small book she had brought for the purpose. What she found troubled her. Not immediately, not in any single number, but in the pattern, which was the thing that people who read accounts quickly often missed. The amounts going out to the estate's suppliers were higher than they should have been for the volume of goods coming in. The records showed payments to 3 separate attorneys for services that were listed only as consultation. There were 2 tenant farmers whose rent accounts were recorded as current, but whose actual payment records, when Elizabeth cross-referenced them carefully, showed significant gaps that had been smoothed over in the ledger without being properly resolved. "Who manages the estate's business accounts?" she asked. "Mr. Harrington deals with those directly, ma'am. And Mr. Caldwell?" "Caldwell. His primary attorney and advisor. He has managed the estate's affairs for—" Mrs. Aldridge paused. "For some time. Since before Mr. Harrington's father passed." A careful pause. "Just after, ma'am." Elizabeth made another note. She looked up and found Mrs. Aldridge watching her with an expression that sat somewhere between hopefulness and fear. "Mrs. Aldridge," Elizabeth said, "I am going to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you tell me will not leave this room. I am not asking so that I can report back to my husband. I am asking because I am trying to understand this estate." The housekeeper's hands were very still in her lap. "Has there been anyone in your time here who has questioned the way the accounts are being managed?" A long silence. "Mr. Harrington's father," Mrs. Aldridge said finally, "asked Mr. Caldwell some questions in the last year before he died. I don't know what answers he received. 2 months after he passed, Mr. Caldwell received a significant increase in his annual retainer." Elizabeth set down her pen. "Thank you," she said. "That's very helpful." She did not approach Nathaniel directly about what she had found. Not yet. She had learned from her years managing her father's household and sitting in on enough of his business conversations to understand how men like Nathaniel Harrington operated, that a direct approach with incomplete evidence was worse than no approach at all. It gave the other person time to prepare. It told them what you knew before you were ready for them to know you knew it. Instead, she kept reading. She asked Thomas, who turned out to be a young man of considerable observation and a useful habit of being invisible in places where important conversations happened, what he knew about the tenant farmers whose accounts she had flagged. He told her carefully that the 2 families in question, the Morrises and the Hensleys, had been farming parcels of Harrington land for 15 and 20 years respectively, and that they had both had difficult harvests 2 years running, and that Mr. Caldwell had told them their accounts were being restructured, which had meant, as best Thomas could tell, that they were now paying interest on the gaps in their records that they hadn't known existed. "Does Mr. Harrington know about this?" Elizabeth asked. Thomas looked at her steadily. "I reckon Mr. Harrington knows what Mr. Caldwell tells him to know, ma'am." Elizabeth thought about that for a long time. She thought about a man who had inherited 1,200 acres and 4 generations of responsibility, and who had spent so much of his energy maintaining the performance of authority that he had apparently never looked closely at what was being done with it in his name. She thought about 2 farm families paying compounding interest on debt they hadn't properly incurred. She thought about a housekeeper who had noticed something was wrong and had not had anyone to tell it to. She thought about what it meant to have power and to mistake the performance of it for its substance. She thought with a kind of complicated ache that Nathaniel Harrington might be many things she had already had confirmed: arrogant, careless with other people's dignity, capable of breathtaking casual cruelty, but that he might also be something she had not yet fully reckoned with. He might be a man who was being stolen from and who did not know it because he had never looked clearly at his own house. 2 weeks into her time at Harrington Crossing, Elizabeth did something that caused more genuine alarm among the household staff than anything she had yet done. She asked to be introduced to the Morrises. Mrs. Aldridge received this request with the expression of a woman who has been asked to open a door she is not certain should be opened. "The tenant farmers, ma'am." "Yes, I'd like to meet them. If you'd let them know I'll be calling Thursday morning, I'd appreciate it. Mr. Harrington doesn't typically, the family isn't expecting." "I understand it's unusual," Elizabeth said, "but I am going, Mrs. Aldridge. I'd rather they had some notice than none." Word reached Nathaniel as she had known it would. He appeared in the doorway of the small sitting room she had claimed as her study. The household had apparently decided collectively that she was going to need a room of her own and had arranged it without being asked, which told her something about how the staff was beginning to see her, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, which she had come to recognize as the gesture he made when he was holding his temper. "I'm told you intend to visit the Morris family," he said. "I do." "May I ask why?" "Because they are tenants on this estate, and I am the mistress of this estate, and it seems reasonable to know who lives and works on our land. The tenant relationships are managed through Caldwell." "I'm aware of that." She met his eyes. "I won't be discussing business with them, Mr. Harrington. I am simply going to introduce myself. It's a courtesy call." He watched her for a moment. The hat turned in his hands. "You are not what I expected," he said. It was not quite the same as what his mother had said, but it came from a similar place. "So I've been told," Elizabeth said pleasantly. "Will that be a problem?" He left without answering, but he didn't tell her not to go. The Morris farm was a mile from the main house along a dirt track that wound between fields that should have been greener than they were. Elizabeth drove herself in the smaller of the estate's gigs, which surprised the stableman considerably, but which she handled with the easy competence of a woman who had grown up in a family where daughters learned practical skills alongside the decorative ones. The Morrises were a family of 5, the parents, 3 children ranging from about 8 to 14. The farmhouse was clean and carefully kept in the way of people who have very little and tend it with great seriousness. Margaret Morris met her at the door with the particular wariness of a woman who has learned that visits from the main house usually mean bad news. "Mrs. Harrington," she said. We weren't expecting." "I know," Elizabeth said. "I apologize for the short notice. I just wanted to introduce myself and to let you know that if there are concerns about the farm that you feel haven't been properly heard, I am available to listen." Margaret Morris looked at her for a long, careful moment. "Come inside," she said. Inside over a cup of tea that Elizabeth accepted with genuine gratitude and drank while sitting at the Morris family table, which she could feel the older woman registering the fact that she sat down and drank it, rather than hovering at the door. She listened. Not to accounting irregularities exactly. Margaret Morris didn't speak in those terms. She spoke in the language of a woman who knew her family was slipping backward and couldn't understand why, who had done everything right, kept the farm up, made her payments, raised her children to work hard and tell the truth, and who had watched the numbers on the paper that arrived from Mr. Caldwell's office grow larger every season in a way she couldn't account for. "My husband went to Mr. Caldwell's office last spring," Margaret said. "He asked for an explanation of the accounting. Mr. Caldwell told him he was confused and that he should leave these matters to people who understood them." Elizabeth set down her teacup. "He wasn't confused," she said quietly. Margaret Morris looked at her. "No," she said. "He wasn't." "I am going to look into this," Elizabeth said. "I'm not making you a promise I might not be able to keep. I don't yet fully understand what's happening, and I'm one woman in a household that is still deciding whether to hear me. But I am going to look." The older woman's eyes were bright. She nodded once the way people nod when they've been carrying something alone for so long that having someone acknowledge the weight of it is itself a form of relief. "Thank you, ma'am," she said, Elizabeth drove back to the main house in the late afternoon light, with the particular feeling of a woman who has lifted a corner of something and seen what is underneath and cannot in conscience put the corner back down again. She had come to Harrington Crossing expecting a difficult marriage to a proud man. She had not expected to find a household full of people who had been waiting without quite knowing it for someone to pay attention. She was paying attention now, and Nathaniel Harrington, she suspected, was about to discover what that meant. The morning after Elizabeth visited the Morris farm, Nathaniel said nothing to her at breakfast. That in itself was not unusual. They had established a pattern over 2 weeks of marriage that functioned less like a domestic arrangement and more like two chess players who had agreed to sit at the same board without yet committing to an opening move. He read his correspondence. She drank her coffee. The household moved around them with the careful quiet of a staff that had learned to read weather. But this morning was different, and Elizabeth felt the difference, the way you feel a change in the air before a storm arrives, not in any single thing, but in the accumulation of small signals. The way Mrs. Aldridge refilled the coffee pot without being asked and then retreated immediately. The way Thomas, passing the dining room doorway on some errand, glanced in and then glanced away too quickly. The way Nathaniel turned the pages of his correspondence with slightly more deliberation than the letters required. He knew she had sat at the Morris family table. She was certain of it. She buttered her bread and waited. He set down his papers. "I've been told," he said without looking up, "that you spent considerable time with the Morris woman yesterday." "About an hour," Elizabeth said. "She made excellent tea. I don't doubt it." He looked up then. His eyes were the particular gray of early morning sky, and they had an assessment in them that she had come to recognize the look of a man recalculating a situation he thought he had already measured. "What were you discussing? The farm, the family, how long they've been working that parcel?" She met his gaze directly. "Mrs. Morris told me her husband tried to get clarification on their account from Mr. Caldwell last spring. That Caldwell told him he was confused." A pause. "He may well have been." "How wasn't?" Elizabeth said. "I've looked at the ledgers, Mr. Harrington. The Morrises are being charged interest on gaps in their payment record that don't correspond to the harvest reports from those same years. The numbers don't agree with each other." Nathaniel's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it shifted. "You've been going through my estate's financial records." "I'm the mistress of this estate. It would be strange if I hadn't. Caldwell manages those accounts. Caldwell has been managing those accounts for approximately 12 years, without any meaningful oversight." She kept her voice even, factual, stripped of accusation. She was not interested in his anger right now. She was interested in his attention. "I'm not telling you what that means. I'm telling you what I found. What it means is your business to determine." He stood up from the table. She had expected that. Men like Nathaniel Harrington stood up when conversations required them to be in motion. It was how they managed the sensation of information arriving faster than they were prepared to receive it. "You will leave Caldwell's accounts alone," he said. "I've already looked at them," she said pleasantly. "I can't unlook. But I take your point about not interfering further until you've had a chance to review what I found. I've written up a summary. It's on the desk in my study if you'd like to read it." He looked at her across the breakfast table with an expression she could not quite name. Not anger precisely. Something that sat beside anger and shared a fence with it, a kind of stunned recalibration. The look of a man who has laid a trap, expecting to catch a rabbit, and found instead that the rabbit had been there first and left him a note. "You planned this," he said. "I planned to understand the estate I married into," she said. The rest of it presented itself. He left the dining room without finishing his breakfast. Elizabeth poured herself a second cup of coffee. Caldwell arrived at Harrington Crossing 3 days later. She knew he was coming because Thomas told her in the quiet way Thomas had developed of passing information without appearing to pass information. A habit she suspected he had learned for his own protection long before she arrived. The attorney's carriage came up the main drive just after mid-morning, and Elizabeth, who had positioned herself in the garden with a book and a clear sightline to the front door, watched him climb out. How was a man of about 55, with the broad, well-fed look of someone who had spent decades being deferred to. He moved with the ease of a man who has never seriously had to account for himself. He glanced toward the garden as he approached the door, and for a brief moment his eyes found Elizabeth, and she offered him a small neutral smile and returned to her book. She wanted him to know she had seen him. She wanted him to have to decide what that meant. She listened to the house. Through the open window above her, she could hear the rumble of male voices from Nathaniel's study. Not words, but the particular rhythm of a conversation where one man is doing most of the talking and the other is listening with increasing agitation. Caldwell's voice was practiced smooth, the voice of a man who had had this kind of conversation before and had learned how to run it. It went on for nearly 2 hours. When Caldwell left, he did not look toward the garden. That told her more than the 2 hours of conversation had told Nathaniel. Nathaniel found her in her study that evening. She had expected him to avoid her. It would have been consistent with his pattern, the way he managed discomfort by increasing the physical distance between himself and its source. Instead, he appeared in her doorway at 7 o'clock, with no hat, this time, no performance of contained authority. He looked for the first time since she had known him genuinely unsettled. Caldwell says the Morris account was restructured at the family's request, he said. That's not what the Morrises told me, Elizabeth said. Caldwell says, Mr. Harrington. She set down her pen. I'm not asking you to choose between Caldwell's version and mine tonight. I'm asking you to do one thing. Pull the original contracts for the Morris and Hensley tenancies, not the summaries Caldwell prepared. The original contracts with your father's signature. Compare them to the current account structure. That's all I'm asking. You're suggesting my own attorney has been falsifying. I'm suggesting the numbers don't agree with each other, and that one of two things is true. Either there was an innocent accounting error that has compounded over years, or there wasn't. Both possibilities are worth understanding. She picked up her pen again. The original contracts are in the estate archive. Your mother could tell you where. She has always managed the household records. He was quiet for long enough that Elizabeth finished the sentence she was writing. How do you know my mother manages the records? He asked. Because I asked her. Another silence. You've been talking to my mother. She's been talking to me, Elizabeth said. There is a difference. I didn't seek her out. She came to find me. People in this house tend to find their way to my study eventually, Mr. Harrington. I'm not entirely sure why. She looked up at him. Maybe because it's the one room where they're fairly confident they won't be dismissed for what they say. The sentence landed. She watched it land. She had not intended it as a weapon exactly, but she had known it would cut, and she held his eyes steadily while it did. He left without speaking. But she heard him 20 minutes later on the stairs toward the attic where the estate archive was kept. She did not see him again until the following morning. He looked like a man who had not slept well, which was, she suspected, an accurate description. He had the particular gray quality of someone who has spent several hours with information they wish they didn't have, turning it over in their mind, trying to find the angle at which it became something less consequential, and failing. He sat down at the breakfast table and looked at her directly. The contracts don't match, he said. No, she said. They don't. The restructuring was not requested by the families. Caldwell filed amended agreements under my father's name 8 months after my father died. He said it flatly, the way people say things they are still in the process of believing. The originals are still in the archive. He didn't pull them. He didn't think anyone would ever cross-reference. He had no reason to expect anyone would, Elizabeth said. Until now. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. The morning light came through the dining room window and lay across the table between them, and in it he looked older than 34. Not in a diminished way, but in the way of a man who has just been handed a version of his own history that he has to decide what to do with. He's been stealing from them, Nathaniel said. For 12 years he's been taking money from tenant families and passing it through accounts I signed without reviewing properly because... He stopped. Because you trusted him, Elizabeth said without judgment. Because I didn't think I needed to look. His jaw was tight. Because I assumed that a man who had worked for my family for that long, authority without oversight produces exactly this, Elizabeth said. It's not a failure of character. It's a failure of attention, and it can be corrected. He looked at her. You're being remarkably charitable. I'm being accurate. There's a difference. She lifted her coffee cup. What are you going to do about it? The question clearly surprised him, not its existence, but the directness of it. He was not accustomed. She had gathered to people asking him what he intended to do, as though the question were simply practical, rather than a judgment on his competence. "I'm going to have Caldwell removed," he said. "I'll need to bring in someone to audit the accounts properly, all of them going back as far as the records allow. And the families will need to be compensated. The Morrises and the Hensleys and anyone else who turns up in the audit." "Yes," Elizabeth said. "This is going to cost a significant amount of money." "Yes," she said again. "It is. And it's going to raise questions." He looked at her steadily. "About how long I let it go on without noticing." "That is the price of fixing it," she said. "The alternative is knowing and not fixing it, which is a great deal more expensive." He held her eyes for a long moment. "How did you find it?" he said. "You've been here 3 weeks. Caldwell has been managing this for 12 years, and no one—" "I looked," she said simply. "I looked at the numbers without any prior assumption about what they were going to tell me. And I cross-referenced things that the summary ledger was designed to keep separate." She set down her cup. "You see what you expect to see, Mr. Harrington. I had no expectations about what I'd find, so I saw what was actually there." Something moved across his face, not quite the expression she would have wanted to see. Not yet, but something in the family of it. Something that was beginning to recognize that the woman sitting across the breakfast table from him was not what he had made of her in that wager at Marcus Webb's card table in February. He stood. "I'll need to write to my solicitor in Richmond," he said. "Someone I trust." "I have a name if it would help," Elizabeth said. "My father's attorney, Mr. Henley, has colleagues in Richmond. He can recommend someone outside your existing circle." Nathaniel looked at her for a beat. "Henley," he said. "The man who told you about the wager." "The same," she said evenly. "He is a good attorney and an honest man. That isn't diminished by the other thing." He nodded once slowly, and then he said something she had not expected. "I underestimated you," he said. Not as an apology exactly. As a fact he was finally acknowledging. "Yes," she said. "You did." He left to write his letters. Elizabeth sat alone at the breakfast table and allowed herself exactly 1 minute of something close to relief, not victory, nothing so clean or simple, but the particular feeling of a thing that had been heading toward collapse, beginning slowly to find a different trajectory. Then she picked up her pen and made a list of the questions she still hadn't answered. The household knew by afternoon that something had changed. Not in any explicit way. No announcement was made. No explanations were offered. But the speed with which news moved through a working estate was something Elizabeth had understood since childhood, and she watched the subtle recalibration happening around her, the way Mrs. Aldridge held herself slightly differently, the way Thomas moved through his work with a quality that was fractionally less braced for impact. The way 2 of the parlor maids passing in the corridor exchanged a look that had the character of something like cautious hope. She did not take credit for it. She understood she had done one thing. She had looked closely at a situation that needed to be looked at, and she had told one person who had the actual power to act. Whether Nathaniel would act fully correctly, without retreating, when the cost became clearer than he currently anticipated, remained to be seen. She was not in the business of predicting what men would do. She had learned that lesson young. Caroline Bellamy arrived on a Thursday. Elizabeth had heard the name twice since coming to Harrington Crossing, once from Thomas, who had mentioned it with a careful neutrality that told her more than the words themselves, and once from Mrs. Aldridge, who had mentioned that Miss Bellamy would likely be calling and had said it in the tone of a woman preparing a houseguest for weather she couldn't prevent. She was 30, dark-haired, beautifully dressed, in the kind of way that required significant financial backing and significant attention to maintain, and she arrived in a carriage that announced itself before it came through the gate. She walked into the front parlor with the ease of a woman entering a space she considered partially her own, and she looked at Elizabeth with a smile that had warmth on the surface and calculation 4 layers underneath. "Mrs. Harrington," she said, "how lovely to finally meet you properly. The wedding was such a crush we didn't have a moment to speak." "Miss Bellamy," Elizabeth said, "won't you sit down?" It was not a question quite. Caroline sat with the particular grace of a woman who knows she is being observed and enjoys it. She looked around the parlor with the expression of a woman noting changes she hadn't approved, and Elizabeth, watching her closely, catalogued every micro-expression with the quiet attention she brought to everything. "How are you settling in?" Caroline asked. "Harrington Crossing can be rather overwhelming at first, I imagine, for someone not accustomed to a house of this scale." "I manage a large household well," Elizabeth said pleasantly. "I've been doing it since I was 19. A small pause. "Of course." Caroline's smile adjusted fractionally. "And Nathaniel, he's been welcoming. I hope he can be rather intense, but he means well." "He's been exactly what I expected," Elizabeth said. Caroline looked at her, reassessing. "You know," she said, "I want to say something that I hope you'll take in the spirit in which it's intended. The wedding, what was said. I want you to know that not everyone thought it was in good taste. Some of us felt it went too far." "Did you?" Elizabeth said. "I did personally." "And yet you were there when the wager was proposed," Elizabeth said. "At Mr. Webb's card table in February. I understand you were part of that evening." The smile flickered. "I was present, yes. I wasn't directly involved in—" "You encouraged it," Elizabeth said. Not harshly, not loudly, simply as a statement of fact that she had arrived at through her own research and was not interested in having reframed. "I've spoken with Mr. Henley, who was also present. He has a good memory." Caroline was very still. "I don't hold it against you in the way you might expect," Elizabeth continued. "You believed that someone from my background had no business entering this social circle, and you helped engineer a situation that you thought would humiliate me and discourage Nathaniel from proceeding. That is a comprehensible motivation, even if it isn't a decent one." "Mrs. Harrington, what I want you to understand," Elizabeth said, "is that the situation did not turn out the way you expected. And the question now is whether you and I are going to spend the next several years of our social acquaintance in a state of managed hostility, or whether we are going to begin from where we actually are." She looked at Caroline directly. "I am prepared for either, but I thought you deserved to know the choice was available." The room was very quiet. Caroline Bellamy looked at Elizabeth Carter Harrington for a long moment, the look of a woman who had walked into a room expecting one kind of opponent and found a different one entirely, and who was in the process of determining whether that was a threat or an opportunity. "You are not remotely what I expected," she said at last. "No one ever is," Elizabeth said. Mundek. Nathaniel, she learned later from Mrs. Aldridge, had been in the corridor during part of that conversation. He had not intervened. He had not announced himself. He had listened, and then he had gone back to his study. She did not ask him what he had heard. But that evening at dinner, for the first time since she had arrived at Harrington Crossing, he asked her a question that was not about the estate, or the accounts, or the household staff. "What was your father like?" he said. She looked up from her plate. The question caught her in an unguarded moment, which was not something that happened to her often, and she felt the unguardedness of it before she could fully organize a response. "Honest," she said. "Genuinely, consistently honest, not as a policy, but as a character. He was the kind of man who couldn't maintain a pretense, even when it would have served him better to. It used to frustrate him in business." She paused. "It's the quality I've always respected most in a person." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Is that a pointed remark?" "It's an answer to your question," she said. "If it feels pointed, you might consider why." He looked at his plate. "Fair enough," he said. It was not by any measure a significant moment. There was no apology in it, no turning point you could mark on a map. But Elizabeth, who had learned to pay attention to the small things, because the small things were where actual change began, noted it. He had asked her something that wasn't tactical. It was the first time. The letter from Richmond arrived 10 days later. The auditor, Nathaniel, had engaged a man named Forsyth, recommended through the chain that began with Mr. Henley, had begun preliminary work on the accounts, and had already in the first week found evidence sufficient to confirm what Elizabeth had identified and to suggest the problem extended further than the 2 tenant families she had flagged. Nathaniel showed her the letter. 5 families, he said. Possibly more. Over 12 years. He sat down in the chair across from her desk with the weight of a man who has been carrying a thing that keeps getting heavier. "Caldwell was operating with my authority and using it to line his own pockets, and I—" "You didn't know," she said. "I should have known." "Yes," she said. You should have looked more closely, that's true. She kept her voice steady and honest, because she had told him she found dishonesty exhausting, and she intended to mean it. But should have and did are different categories. The question is what you do now. Forsyth says we can pursue legal action. That's worth considering carefully, she said. A public legal proceeding will expose the full scope of what happened under your management. Some of that will be painful, I know. It may affect how people see you. I know that too. He looked at her directly. Are you advising against it? I'm advising that you go in with your eyes open. She leaned forward slightly. I think you should pursue it. I think the families who were defrauded deserve the formal acknowledgement of what was done to them. I think the cost to your reputation of doing the right thing is less than the cost to your character of not doing it. He held her gaze for a long moment. You know, he said. When I made that wager about you, I told Marcus you were proud and sharp-tongued and that you'd be brought to heel inside 3 months. I know, she said. I was completely wrong about all of it. You were wrong about the brought to heel part, she said. The proud and sharp-tongued part you had approximately right. Something moved in his face. Then something that had not been there before. Something that began in the vicinity of his eyes and had the quality of a man catching a glimpse of who he might have been if he had started from a different place. It was not a smile exactly, but it was close. Forsyth needs a full list of every tenancy on the estate, he said, and the original contracts where available. My mother knows where the archive records are organized. Your mother and I have already started pulling them, Elizabeth said. He stared at her. When, Tuesday, she came to my study and asked if she could help. I said yes. For a moment he looked at her with an expression she had no word for. Then he said quietly, She hasn't offered to help with the state business in 7 years. Not since my father died. I know, Elizabeth said. She told me. She also told me she'd been waiting to see whether someone was going to do something about this situation, or whether it was going to continue indefinitely. She paused. She's been watching Caldwell for years, Mr. Harrington. She noticed the discrepancies long before I arrived. She just didn't have anyone who was in a position to act on what she'd found. The silence that followed had a different quality than any silence they had shared before. She never told me, he said. She tried once, Elizabeth said gently. You told her she didn't understand how these things worked. It landed the way she had known it would. She watched him absorb it, the particular kind of impact that comes not from cruelty, but from fact, from the accumulated weight of things left undone that cannot be called back. How long ago? He asked. 4 years. He stood up. He went to the window. He stood with his back to her for a long moment. I have to go speak with my mother, he said. Yes, she said. I think you do. He was almost at the door when he stopped. Without turning, he said, Elizabeth. It was the first time he had used her given name. She waited. Thank you, he said, and then he left. She sat alone in her study, with the list of names in front of her, and the sound of his footsteps going down the corridor toward his mother's rooms, and she felt the shape of something beginning not yet defined, not yet certain, and carrying a weight of pain that she was not prepared to pretend didn't exist. But beginning. She picked up her pen and went back to work. The dinner invitation went out on a Monday. Elizabeth found out about it the way she found out about most things at Harrington Crossing. Not from Nathaniel directly, but through the household's quiet current of information that flowed around her husband's decisions, the way water flows around stone. Mrs. Aldridge brought the news while Elizabeth was reviewing the corrected tenancy ledgers in her study, setting a stack of fresh linen on the chair by the door, and mentioning with the careful neutrality she had perfected that Mr. Harrington had instructed her to prepare the main dining room for a dinner party the following Saturday. 30 guests. Full service. The best silver. Elizabeth set down her pen. Did he say what the occasion was? She asked. No, ma'am, Mrs. Aldridge said. Only that it was to be the best the house could manage. Elizabeth thanked her and waited until the door closed before she allowed herself to sit very still for a moment and think. 30 guests. The best silver. 3 weeks after Caldwell's removal and the beginning of Forsyth's audit. 3 weeks after Elizabeth had sat across from Caroline Bellamy in the front parlor and laid certain facts on the table between them, like cards. 3 weeks after Nathaniel had gone down the corridor to speak with his mother for the first time in what Eleanor Harrington had told her quietly was a very long time. She knew without being told what this dinner was. It was a recalibration. Nathaniel was a man of standing in Virginia society, and standing was managed through performance, through the careful orchestration of who sat at your table and how the food was served and what impression the evening left. Something had shifted inside the walls of Harrington Crossing over the past weeks, and she suspected that shift had reached his circle the way things always reached circles like his, through whisper and implication. A wife who sat with tenant farmers. An attorney dismissed after decades. A mother suddenly visible in the running of the estate. He needed to remind his world that he was still in command. She was fairly certain she was the thing he intended to use to do it. She picked up her pen and went back to work. She did not confront him about it. She had learned over these weeks that confrontation for its own sake was a tool with a limited range. It felt satisfying and accomplished very little. Instead, she went to find Eleanor Harrington. Nathaniel's mother occupied a suite of rooms in the south wing that had the quality of a place where someone had been gradually politely reduced. It was not that the rooms were neglected, they were well kept, warmly furnished, full of the accumulated objects of a long life. But there was a smallness to Eleanor's world that Elizabeth had noticed from the first week, a contraction that had happened slowly enough that perhaps no one had named it until now. Eleanor was at her writing desk when Elizabeth knocked, and she turned with the particular brightness of a woman who has been keeping her own company and is genuinely glad to see someone. "Elizabeth," she said. "Sit down. I was hoping you'd come by." "Did you know about the dinner?" Elizabeth asked, settling into the chair across from her. "He told me this morning," Eleanor said. "He said he wanted to have some people for supper. That's how he phrased it. Some people." She set down her pen. "In my experience, when Nathaniel describes 30 guests as some people, he is planning something he expects to be uncomfortable." "For whom?" Eleanor looked at her steadily. "I believe he would say for you, my dear, though I suspect it will not go the way he anticipates." "What does he want from this evening?" "I think he wants to show his circle that he is still the man they believe him to be," Eleanor said carefully. "That whatever has happened in this house recently has not diminished him." She folded her hands on the desk. "He has always managed his standing through these evenings, controlled the narrative as it were, kept people in a position where they were guests at his table and therefore already predisposed toward him. And I'm to be the evidence that everything is in order," Elizabeth said. "Or the evidence that it isn't," Eleanor said quietly, "depending on how the evening goes." Elizabeth looked at the older woman. "What do you think I should do?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the afternoon was wearing toward gold. "I think," she said finally, "that you should go to that dinner as exactly who you are, not who he expects you to be, not who his guests expect you to be, yourself." She paused. "I have watched this house for 30 years, Elizabeth. The people who have lasted in Nathaniel's life, the ones he has actually respected however little he has shown it, have been the ones who refuse to be shaped by his expectations. Has there been anyone like that?" Elizabeth asked. Eleanor smiled, and it was a smile with a history in it. "His father," she said. "And now I think you." Saturday arrived with the quality of days that know they are going to matter. The house was in motion from early morning. Mrs. Aldridge commanding her staff with the focused efficiency of a woman who understood that the physical perfection of an evening was the only domain she fully controlled, and who intended to exercise that control to its limits. The silver was polished. The linens were pressed. The kitchen produced smells that moved through the house like an argument for civilization. Elizabeth dressed herself with care. Not with the anxious over-preparation of a woman trying to make an impression, but with the deliberate attention of one who understood that appearance was a form of communication, and who intended to communicate clearly. She chose the dark blue silk, her best, her mother's favorite on her, and she did her own hair simply without affectation. She wore the pearl earrings that had been her grandmother's, and no other jewelry. When she came downstairs, Thomas was in the front hall with a vase of flowers that someone had sent ahead, and he stopped when he saw her and said in a tone that was entirely genuine, "You look fine, ma'am. Real fine." "Thank you, Thomas," she said. "You're going to be all right tonight," he said. It was not quite a question. "I intend to be," she said. And she meant it the way she meant most things, not as performance, but as decision. The guests arrived between 7 and 1/2 past, filtering in with the collective energy of Virginia society, given an occasion and a good address. Elizabeth stood in the receiving line beside Nathaniel and shook 30 hands and received 30 varieties of curiosity. Some of it open, some of it veiled, some of it the particular curiosity of people who have heard something they aren't sure they're allowed to acknowledge and are looking for some signal about whether they may. Nathaniel was smooth and practiced at this. She would give him that. He moved through the room with the ease of a man who had been performing confidence since childhood. And for the first hour of the evening, the dinner had the surface texture of any other fine gathering good food, practiced conversation, the comfortable sounds of people who are used to being comfortable. It was Marcus Webb who broke the surface. He did it at the turning point of the main course when the wine had been refilled and the conversation had settled into the loose, expansive quality of a gathering that believes itself safely established. He was 3 seats down from Elizabeth, and he leaned forward with the smile of a man who enjoys the particular sport of saying something that other people are thinking and have chosen not to say. "Mrs. Harrington," he said, "I have to tell you everyone's been dying to ask, what's all this business about Caldwell Nathaniel being so mysterious about it? Some of us have heard rather alarming things." The table quieted. Not completely, there were still several conversations continuing in the lower registers, but enough. The way a room quiets when it recognizes that something is about to be said that will require its attention. Elizabeth set down her fork. She had prepared for several versions of this evening, and she had prepared for Marcus Webb, specifically because Marcus Webb was the kind of man who believed that social occasions were arenas, and that asking pointed questions at dinner parties was a form of sport. She had thought carefully over the preceding week about what she would say if he opened a door and whether she would walk through it. She had decided she would. "Mr. Webb," she said with a pleasantness that was genuine, because she had decided it would be, "It's not mysterious at all. Mr. Caldwell was found to have been misappropriating funds from several of the estate's tenant families for approximately 12 years. My husband has engaged an auditor from Richmond to establish the full scope of the matter, and Caldwell has been dismissed. The affected families will be compensated." Complete silence. Not the partial silence of before. The full silence of 30 people who have been handed something entirely different from what they expected and are adjusting. Marcus Webb's smile had not moved, but it had gone rigid. "Misappropriating," he said. "Stealing," Elizabeth said pleasantly. "I find that word clearer." Someone at the far end of the table coughed. Someone else set down a wine glass. 12 years, said Judge Alderton, who was seated 4 chairs to Elizabeth's right, and who had the sharp-eyed quality of a man whose profession had made him incapable of hearing information without filing it. "Under the estate's authority." "Under the appearance of the estate's authority," Elizabeth said. "The documents were forged in the name of Mr. Harrington's father 8 months after his death." She looked down the table toward Nathaniel. "My husband moved immediately to address the matter as soon as it was identified. I want that to be clearly understood." Nathaniel was watching her. She could not read his expression fully from her position, but she held his gaze for a moment before returning her attention to the table. "How was it identified?" Judge Alderton asked. "I identified it," Elizabeth said, "through the estate accounts which I began reviewing in my first week here." Another silence with a different quality. This one had weight to it, the weight of 30 people recalculating what they thought they knew about the woman sitting at Nathaniel Harrington's table. Marcus Webb recovered himself. "Well," he said with the tone of a man attempting to reassert a narrative, "he has lost. I suppose we should all be grateful someone was paying attention. Though I must say, Nathaniel," and here he looked down the table with the smile of a man who has a weapon he's been waiting to use, "it must be rather a thing having one's wife dig through one's accounts. Not precisely what most of us would call comfortable." The table held its breath. Nathaniel looked at Marcus Webb for a moment, with an expression Elizabeth had not seen on his face before. It was not the contained authority look she had catalogued in their first weeks. It was something older and more direct. "Marcus," he said, "my wife found evidence that my estate was being robbed. What she found protects families who had been vulnerable for over a decade. The only uncomfortable thing about it is that it took someone new to this house to see what I should have seen myself. He picked up his wine glass. I'd call that a lesson rather than a complaint. The silence that followed was of an entirely different character than any previous silence that evening. Elizabeth did not look at him. She looked at her plate, and she allowed the moment to settle without commentary because commentary would have diminished it. He had said it plainly and without performance, and the plainness of it was its power. Marcus Webb said nothing more. After dinner, the gathering moved to the parlor in the way of these evenings, and the conversations fragmented into smaller, more particular currents. Elizabeth moved through them with the attention of a woman cataloging everything, not for advantage, not from suspicion, but because she had always understood that a room's real conversation happened at its edges in the clusters that formed away from the center. Judge Alderton found her by the bookcase. How was a man of about 60, with the careful quality of someone who had spent his professional life distinguishing between what was said and what was meant, and he looked at Elizabeth with the direct appraisal of a man who has decided a conversation is worth having. "Mrs. Harrington," he said, "what you described at dinner, the forged documents, the timing, the scope, that is a serious matter." "Yes," she said. "Forsyth is a capable auditor. I know his work." He paused. "If what you've described holds in full, and from what you've said, I believe it will. Caldwell is looking at criminal charges. This will not stay private." "I know that," she said. "My husband knows that." Alderton looked at her. He was prepared to have this conversation publicly. Tonight. In front of these people. "He was," she said. "That took something," Alderton said with a kind of dry respect. "Most men in his position would have managed it quietly, paid the families off under some other name, and buried the thing." "That was not acceptable," Elizabeth said simply. "No," Alderton said. "It wasn't." He studied her for a moment. "The Morris family, I've known Robert Morris for 20 years. He's a decent man. He never said anything to me about this." "He didn't believe anyone would act on it," Elizabeth said. Alderton was quiet. "And you changed that." "I paid attention," she said. "That's all." He nodded once slowly. "Well," he said, "Virginia's going to be talking about tonight for some time." "I expect so," she said. He raised his glass fractionally, not quite a toast, but something in the neighborhood of one, and moved off to find another conversation. Caroline Bellamy came to her near the fireplace at 9:30. She had been at the dinner. Elizabeth had noted her arrival among the guests, had exchanged a civil nod across the room, had kept track of her position. The way you keep track of anything you understand to be a variable. Caroline moved through social situations with a social intelligence Elizabeth respected, even if she did not entirely trust. And tonight, Caroline had been watchful in a way that was different from her usual performative ease. She stopped beside Elizabeth now, with a glass of wine, and the expression of a woman who is revising something she had believed to be settled. "That was remarkable," she said quietly. "The dinner," Elizabeth said. "What you did at dinner." Caroline looked at her sideways. "You gave him away to tell the truth in front of all of us. You opened the door and let him walk through it with some dignity and tact." She paused. "Most women in your position would have made certain he had none." Elizabeth considered that. "Destroying him wouldn't have helped the Morris family," she said. "Or the Hensleys, or anyone else on that list." "No," Caroline said. "But it might have felt satisfying." "Briefly," Elizabeth said. "And then what I still have to live in this house. He still has the authority to make that very difficult. And the people on the estate still need what they need, regardless of whether I've enjoyed myself at their expense." She looked at Caroline directly. "I didn't come here to win a war, Miss Bellamy. I came here to build something that works." Caroline was quiet for a moment. "Why?" she said. It was a genuine question, stripped of the social calculation that usually layered her speech. "You could have left. After what he did at the wedding, your family would have supported you. The sympathy would have been entirely with you." "Yes," Elizabeth said. "So why didn't you?" Elizabeth was quiet for a moment herself. It was a fair question, and she owed it a fair answer. "Because leaving would have been easy. she said finally. And easy was not what I married him for. Caroline looked at her for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, I owe you an apology. For February. For the card table. I know you do, Elizabeth said. I'm offering one. I know that too, Elizabeth said. And after a beat, I'll take it. Something shifted in Caroline's expression. The careful, managed surface giving way to something more real beneath it. You are the most unusual woman I have ever met, she said. So I've been told, Elizabeth said. Nathaniel found her on the back veranda as the last guests were leaving. The night had the particular quality of Virginia in late summer, thick and warm, and full of the sound of insects in the dark. She had come outside for air after the sustained effort of the evening, which had been despite everything its own kind of exhaustion. Not an unpleasant one, but exhaustion nonetheless. He came and stood beside her. They were quiet for the moment, in the way they had become occasionally capable of being quiet together. Not the hostile silence of their first weeks. Not the careful, managed silence of people who don't trust each other, but something with more space in it. That was not how I expected tonight to go, he said. What did you expect? She asked. I was quiet for a moment. Honestly, I thought I was going to spend the evening managing your position in front of people who'd been wondering about you. Showing them that, he stopped. That you still had control of your house, she said. Yes. He said it without defensiveness. That's what I thought I was doing. And instead, I sat at my own table and watched you tell 30 of Virginia's most prominent people the truth about what happened in my house, and then He stopped again. I heard myself agreeing with you, out loud, in front of Marcus Webb. He turned slightly. I hadn't planned that. No, she said. You hadn't. Did you? She looked at him. I planned to tell the truth if I was asked directly. That part I planned. What you said that wasn't mine to plan. I was quiet for a long moment. What Webb said, he began. About it being uncomfortable having a wife in the accounts. You don't have to explain what you said, she told him. I want to. He turned to face her more fully. I have spent most of my adult life telling people what I thought they wanted to hear in order to maintain a position that felt important to me. What I said tonight to Webb, that was the first time in a very long while that I said something because it was simply true. He paused. It felt different than I expected. Different how? Less terrible, he said. And then after a pause with something that was almost self-aware enough to be humor. I realize that is not a very high bar. Elizabeth looked at him in the dark. She thought about the man who had lifted his glass at their wedding and performed his cruelty in front of 200 people for the entertainment of his circle. She thought about the carriage ride to this house, and the room she had been given to remind her of her place, and the morning she had found Thomas alone with his burned hand. She thought about 12 years of tenant families paying interest on debt that wasn't theirs, and an attorney who had banked on the certainty that no one would ever look closely enough. She thought about all of it, and she did not let go of any of it. She did not intend to let go of it. It was true, and it had happened, and forgiveness, real forgiveness, not the performance of it, was not a thing she was prepared to manufacture on a timeline that served anyone's comfort. But she also thought about a man going up to an attic archive at 10 o'clock at night to look at original contracts. A man walking down a corridor to speak to his mother. A man saying at his own dinner table in front of Marcus Webb that his wife had found something he should have found himself. Why did you do it? She asked. Tonight. What you said to Webb. You didn't have to. He looked at her steadily. No, he said. I didn't. Then why? I was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, because you have been honest with me from the first night in this house. Even when it cost you. Even when I gave you no reason to be. He paused. It seemed like time to try it myself. She said nothing. I know, he said quietly, that I have given you a great many reasons not to trust that. I know that one honest statement at a dinner party does not constitute a change in character. I'm not asking you to believe it does. Good, she said. Because I don't. I know. But I am. She stopped. Chose her words with the care she always used when the words mattered. I'm watching, she said. "I told you on our wedding night that I believed you could be more than the worst thing you'd done. I haven't stopped believing that. But belief without evidence is just hope, and hope is not something I spend carelessly." "What would evidence look like?" he asked. "The families on Forsyth's list," she said. "All of them. Compensated fully. Not partially, not quietly, properly, with an acknowledgement of what was done." She looked at him directly. "And the school." He paused. "What school?" "Margaret Morris has 3 children," Elizabeth said. "2 of the Hensley children can't read. There are workers' families on this estate who have been here for a generation with no access to any form of education. If this estate is going to be what you told Marcus Webb tonight, you wanted it to be a well-run, respected operation, then the people who run it need to be able to read a contract." She held his gaze. "I want to build a school for the workers' children, on estate land, with estate funds." The silence stretched. "That's a significant undertaking," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is. It would be seen as unusual." "A great many things I do are unusual," she said. "That has not stopped me yet." He looked at her for a long moment, the long measuring look of a man who is genuinely trying to see something and not merely to assess it. "All right," he said. She had not expected the answer so quickly, and she did not entirely trust its speed. "Just like that," she said. "Just like that," he said. "I've watched you for 6 weeks, Elizabeth. I've watched you find what everyone else missed, say what no one else would say, and sit at a tenant farmer's kitchen table like it was the most natural thing in the world." He paused. "If you think a school is what this estate needs, I believe you." She studied him. "I'm still watching," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm counting on it." They stood on the veranda in the warm Virginia night, with the sound of the last carriage pulling away down the drive, and the distance between them was different than it had ever been. Not closed, not resolved, still carrying everything it needed to carry, but no longer simply empty. It was, Elizabeth thought, a beginning, not an ending, not a resolution, not the kind of clean, completed thing that people told themselves love was supposed to look like. A beginning. She turned and went back inside. He held the door for her. The morning after the dinner party, a letter arrived that changed everything. Mrs. Aldridge brought it to Elizabeth's study with the particular care of a woman who has looked at something she was not supposed to look at and is now carrying the weight of what she saw. She set it on the desk with both hands and said quietly, "This came for Mr. Harrington, ma'am. But Mr. Harrington is out riding the South Fields and asked that any urgent correspondence be brought to you." Elizabeth looked at the letter. The seal was Forsyth's, the Richmond auditor, but it had been sent express, which meant he had not wanted it to wait for the regular post. "Thank you, Mrs. Aldridge," Elizabeth said. She waited until the housekeeper had closed the door before she opened it. She read it once quickly for the shape of what it contained. Then she read it again slowly for the specifics. Then she sat very still. Forsyth had found something none of them had anticipated. The accounting irregularities went deeper than Caldwell. Significantly deeper. There was a second name in the records embedded in the earliest transactions predating Caldwell's involvement by nearly 4 years, buried in the kind of layered documentation that was specifically designed to be invisible unless you were already looking for it. The second name was not a stranger's. It was a name Elizabeth recognized. It was the name of a man who had attended Saturday's dinner, who had sat 3 seats from her, who had raised his glass to Nathaniel and called him an old friend. Marcus Webb had been taking money from Harrington Crossing long before Caldwell ever arrived. She read the letter a third time, not because the words had changed, not because she expected the meaning to shift on a third reading into something more manageable. She read it because she was a woman who had learned never to act on information she hadn't fully absorbed, and what Forsyth had written required absorbing carefully before it became action. Marcus Webb. The name sat in the middle of Forsyth's careful professional prose, like a stone dropped into still water, and Elizabeth sat with the rings expanding outward from it, and thought about everything she had observed in the weeks since coming to Harrington Crossing. She thought about the card table in February, the wager, the particular ease with which Marcus had announced it at the wedding, the way he had held the room, the way he had enjoyed it. Not just the performance of it, but the specific quality of a man exercising a power he was completely confident in. The kind of confidence that comes not from social standing alone, but from knowing something no one else in the room knows. She thought about Saturday's dinner. The way Marcus had leaned forward with that question about Caldwell calculated, she understood now, not merely provocative. He had wanted to know how much Nathaniel knew. He had wanted to measure the exposure. She thought about how long 4 years before Caldwell was. If Forsyth's timeline was accurate, and Forsyth was not a man who put uncertain things in express letters. Marcus Webb had been extracting money from Harrington Crossing since before Nathaniel's father died, possibly since Nathaniel's father was still alive. And when Caldwell arrived and began his own scheme, Webb had either recruited him or recognized a useful parallel operation and stayed quiet about it in exchange for continued access. 12 years of combined theft. From a man who sat at Nathaniel's table and called him an old friend. Elizabeth folded the letter carefully. She put it inside her book. She went to find her husband. How was coming up from the South Fields, when she met him at the fence line, she had walked out rather than wait, because she was not. She had decided going to deliver this kind of news inside a house where the walls had ears, and the staff had enough to manage without carrying this particular weight on top of it. Nathaniel saw her coming, and something in his face adjusted the kind of adjustment a man makes when the person walking toward him with deliberate purpose is his wife, and he has learned over the past several weeks that deliberate purpose usually means something significant. He came through the fence gate and stood before her. What's happened? She handed him the letter. She watched him read it. She watched his face do the thing faces do when the mind is moving faster than the body can keep up with a kind of controlled stillness that is not calm but is the effort toward it. He read it once. He read it again. He looked up. Webb, he said. One word, flat. Yes, she said. 4 years before Caldwell. That's what Forsyth found. The earliest transactions predate your father's death by approximately 8 months. Which means my father may have known something was wrong, Nathaniel said quietly. Before he died. He stopped. The implication of that settled between them with the weight of something that cannot be unsettled once it lands. He asked Caldwell questions in that last year. My mother told you that. Yes. I wasn't asking about Caldwell, Nathaniel said. He was asking about the accounts because something had caught his attention. Something that had caught his attention because Webb... He stopped again. Because Webb had already been taking money for months, Elizabeth said, and your father had noticed the numbers didn't agree with themselves. Nathaniel looked at the letter in his hands. His jaw was set with the particular tension of a man who is holding a very large emotion in check through deliberate effort. Webb was my father's friend, he said. Before he was mine. He sat at this table when I was a boy. He came to my father's funeral. I know, Elizabeth said quietly. He sat at our dinner table Saturday night. He asked about Caldwell's removal. The controlled stillness cracked slightly. He was measuring how close we were to finding him. Yes. Nathaniel looked up from the letter. His eyes were the gray of an overcast morning, and they had in them something Elizabeth had not seen before. Not the managed authority of a man performing control. Not the recalculating look of someone reassessing a situation, but something rawer. Something that had to do with betrayal at a depth that management could not reach. He was my friend, he said. I know, she said again. She did not tell him she was sorry. She had found that when something was genuinely this large, expressions of sorrow from the wrong person felt like an intrusion. What he needed right now was not comfort. What he needed was someone to stand beside him while he reckoned with it. She stood there. He folded the letter. He handed it back to her. I need to go speak with Judge Alderton, he said. Yes, she said. You do. How was at Saturday's dinner? He knows both of us now, and he knows Webb. He's also the most capable legal mind in this county, Elizabeth said. And after Saturday I believe he will hear you fairly. Nathaniel nodded once. He looked at her directly. How long have you suspected Webb? He asked. Since Saturday night, she said. At dinner. The way he asked about Caldwell, it wasn't the question of a concerned friend. It was the question of a man taking inventory. She paused. I didn't have evidence until this morning. I wouldn't have said anything before I had evidence. He absorbed that. You were watching him, he said. I watch everyone, she said. It's my most useful quality and my most exhausting one. Something moved through his expression. A complicated thing made of grief and anger, and something else she couldn't yet name. I asked you once why you stayed, he said. After everything, you told me you thought I was worth the risk. I did. I want you to know, he said, that the risk you took has cost you a great deal, more than it should have, and I am aware of that. He stopped. I don't have the right words for it yet, but I wanted you to know I'm aware. Elizabeth looked at her husband standing in the morning light with Forsyth's letter in his hands and his friend's name on it. Go find Alderton, she said. We'll talk when you get back. He went. Judge Alderton came to Harrington Crossing that same afternoon. Elizabeth had expected him to be measured, careful the professional face he wore in public gatherings. Instead, he arrived with his coat slightly less composed than usual, and an expression that told her he had ridden fast, which told her Nathaniel had communicated not just the fact of the letter, but the weight of it. He sat in Nathaniel's study, with the letter on the desk between them, and read it with the focused attention of a man for whom documents were a primary language. When he looked up, he said, This is enough to open a formal investigation. Is it enough to act on? Nathaniel asked. It is enough to compel Webb to account for himself before a legal proceeding, Alderton said. Whether it is enough to convict depends on what Forsyth turns up in the remaining accounts. But the express letter tells me Forsyth himself believes the foundation is solid. He looked at Nathaniel steadily. You understand what this means. Webb is connected to half the county. This will not be a quiet matter. It wasn't going to be quiet regardless, Nathaniel said. Caldwell's removal is already circulating. People will connect them. They will, Alderton agreed. He paused. There are people who will say you should have managed this privately, settled it without formal proceedings, preserved the social order. There are tenant families who have been paying fraudulent debt for over a decade, Elizabeth said. The social order they were protecting is not one I'm interested in preserving. Alderton looked at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize from serious men who were not accustomed to encountering a woman in a business conversation, and were discovering in real time that they had been underutilizing a significant resource. Mrs. Harrington, he said, I'm going to need your account of the discovery. When you found the original discrepancy, how you identified it, the sequence of what you cross-referenced. He glanced at Nathaniel. Her testimony may be relevant. Her testimony is the foundation of the entire thing, Nathaniel said. Alderton nodded slowly. Then we proceed. It took Webb 4 days to hear that Alderton had been at Harrington Crossing. Elizabeth knew this because Caroline Bellamy told her Caroline, who had been moving through the post-dinner social landscape of Charlottesville with her particular social intelligence, and who had in the weeks since their conversation in the parlor begun operating in Elizabeth's orbit with something that was not quite alliance, but was no longer opposition. He knows, Caroline said. She had come to the house without formal invitation, which Elizabeth had decided to interpret as a development rather than a transgression. He was at the Ellsworth dinner last night. He was not himself, quieter than usual, watching. What is he saying? Elizabeth asked. Nothing yet. That's what's unusual. Marcus Webb not saying anything is a larger statement than Marcus Webb saying a great deal. Caroline looked at her directly. He's going to move before you can formalize the investigation. I know how he operates. What will he do? He'll go to Nathaniel directly, Caroline said. He'll try to settle it between them. Man to man, old friendship, all of that. He'll offer to repay some portion of what was taken and call it a misunderstanding and ask Nathaniel to let Alderton stand down. And if Nathaniel refuses? Caroline's expression was carefully neutral. Then he'll suggest that Nathaniel has been poorly advised by a woman who doesn't understand how these things work. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. He'll try to make this about me, she said. He'll try to make this about your influence on your husband, Caroline said. He'll say you've pushed Nathaniel into a course of action that will damage him socially, that a formal proceeding will embarrass the family, that old friends settle old business between themselves. She paused. It is not an argument without some appeal. Nathaniel has known Webb for 30 years. I know, Elizabeth said. Do you trust him? Caroline asked. Not unkindly, just directly. Elizabeth thought about it honestly. I trust that he has begun to understand what trust costs, she said. I don't know yet whether that understanding will hold under the pressure of a man he has known since childhood, telling him to let it go. She found out 2 days later. Webb came on a Tuesday morning without announcement, which was itself a kind of statement, the arrival of a man who believed himself sufficiently at home in another man's house to dispense with the courtesy of notice. Thomas brought the word to Elizabeth first, which told her that the household had its own understanding of the information hierarchy, and she went to stand in the upstairs corridor where she could hear the study without being in it. She was not proud of that, but she was practical. Webb's voice carried easily. It was a voice built for carrying. Nathaniel, he said, and the warmth in it had the particular quality of warmth being deployed like a tool selected for a purpose. I think we need to talk about what's happening here. Before it goes somewhere, neither of us wants it to go. Sit down, Marcus, Nathaniel said. His voice was even. She could not read it from the corridor, and she was not certain she was meant to. This business with Forsyth, Webb said. I know what he thinks he's found, and I want to explain. I've read the letter, Nathaniel said. I've also spoken with Alderton. A pause. You went to Alderton before you came to me. The letter came last Monday, Nathaniel said. You came today. Another pause. Longer. Webb recalculating. Nathaniel, we have known each other since we were boys. Your father. Don't, Nathaniel said. Quiet. Absolute. The silence that followed was the kind that happens after a door closes on something that was trying to come through. I was in a difficult position, Webb said. His voice had changed. The warmth was still there, but there was something underneath it now, something more careful. Your father's estate was mismanaged for years before I arrived in the accounts. I simply adjusted for what was already there. I intended to, Marcus. Nathaniel's voice was still even, and its evenness was more devastating than anger would have been. I have the original ledgers. I have my father's notes. I have a signed account from the month before he died, in which he wrote down the name of the discrepancy he had found and where he thought it was coming from. A beat. He knew it was you. He died before he could act on it. Complete silence. Nathaniel. You came to his funeral, Nathaniel said. You stood at his graveside, and then you went back to his accounts. Elizabeth put her hand against the wall. Whatever she had expected from this conversation, she had not expected Nathaniel to have found his father's notes. She had not known he was looking for them. She thought about a man who had gone up to the attic archive on one night and had apparently gone back again without telling her, working through his father's private papers in the hours when the house was quiet, following a thread she had started pulling and taking it further than she had known. Those notes were private correspondence, Webb said, and there was something under his voice now that was not quite panic, but was in the neighborhood of it. They wouldn't be admissible in any. I'm not talking about what's admissible, Nathaniel said. I'm talking about what happened. You stole from my father while he was alive. You stole from this estate after he died. You brought Caldwell in as a secondary operation, and you stayed quiet about his thefts because his thefts kept attention away from yours. He paused. How long did you think it would go on? I thought. Webb stopped, started again. I thought things would stay as they were. I thought the estate would continue to be run the way it had always been run. I did not account for my wife, Nathaniel said. Silence. I did not account for her, no, Webb said. And there it was, the calculation showing through the warmth, clean and cold. Nathaniel, she has been here 9 weeks. She doesn't understand the history of these arrangements. She doesn't understand how things work between old families in this county. If you will allow me to speak with her. You will not speak with my wife, Nathaniel said. The evenness was gone. What replaced it was something with edges. You will not come to this house again without a legal representative present, and I would suggest you engage a very good one. A chair scraped. Footsteps. The study door opened. Elizabeth had moved back down the corridor before Webb came into the hallway, and she was standing at the top of the stairs with a book when he looked up and saw her. He stopped. She looked at him directly. He was 52 years old, she thought, and he looked it fully for the first time. Not the broad, well-fed ease of Saturday's dinner, but something reduced, something that had been stripped of the confidence that had kept it inflated. He looked at her with an expression she had no precise word for, something that was part calculation and part something older, the look of a man who has been thoroughly, completely seen. She did not say anything. She did not need to. He left. Nathaniel came up the stairs and found her there. He looked at her and said, "You heard." "I heard enough," she said. "My father's notes," he said. "I found them Thursday. I didn't want to tell you until I'd read all of them." He exhaled. He'd been working on it for months. He had the broad shape of it. He didn't have enough time. Elizabeth looked at her husband. "He would have stopped it," she said. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "He would have." A pause. "He was a better man than I've been." "He had more practice," she said. "And you're working on it." He almost smiled. It was small and tired, and had the quality of a man who is carrying a great deal and knows it, but it was genuine. "Alderton is filing the formal complaint tomorrow," he said. "Once that's done, it becomes a legal matter and not a personal one. Webb will answer to the court." "Good," she said. "It's going to be—" He searched for the word. "Significant. Publicly. I know. People will say things about how it was handled, about whether a formal proceeding was necessary, about your role in it. People will say a great many things," Elizabeth said. "They always do. The question is whether the things they say are true, and whether what we did was right. The rest of it I can manage." He looked at her for a long moment. "How?" he said. "How do you manage it? The noise of it. The things people say. You have been in this county for 9 weeks, and you have turned over more stones than anyone has touched in 12 years, and the people whose stones they are will not. They will not be kind about it." "No," she said. "They won't." "And that doesn't—" He stopped. Tried again. "Doesn't it frighten you?" She considered the question honestly, because he had asked it honestly. "Yes," she said. "Sometimes. Mostly at night when I'm tired and it's quiet and there's no immediate problem to solve it. Yes, it frightens me." She held his gaze. "But I have found that the things worth doing are almost always the things that frighten you. And the alternative is to leave the Morris family paying interest on debt they don't owe, and your father's name attached to an accounting that dishonored everything he actually stood for." She paused. "That frightens me more." Nathaniel looked at her with the full attention he was gradually learning to give to things, not the assessing, calibrating attention of their first weeks, but something more open. Something that was actually trying to receive rather than simply measure. "I owe you something," he said. "More than I can articulate properly. But I want to begin trying." "Then begin with the families on Forsyth's list," she said. "All of them, properly. Don't wait for the court proceedings to establish the amounts. Do the moral accounting first, and let the legal accounting catch up." "I've already drafted the letters," he said. "They go out tomorrow, same post as Alderton's filing." She looked at him. "You drafted them already?" "Last night," he said. "My mother helped me with the wording." He paused. "She's better with that kind of thing than I am." Elizabeth thought about Eleanor Harrington in her South Wing rooms, the contracted world she had been living in, and the particular brightness she showed now when Elizabeth came to find her. "She's better at a great many things than you've given her credit for," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm working on that too." The letters went out Wednesday morning. By Thursday, Margaret Morris had sent a reply that Mrs. Aldridge brought to Elizabeth with both hands and set on the desk, and then stood beside for a moment, which told Elizabeth that the housekeeper had read it, which she did not mind at all. The letter was short. Margaret Morris was not a woman who had been given much occasion to practice the formal language of correspondence, and the letter showed it and was better for it. "Mrs. Harrington," it read. "My husband read your husband's letter 3 times, and then he went outside and I didn't see him for an hour. When he came back, he said to tell you that the Carter family raised their daughter right. I don't know if I'm saying this the proper way, but I wanted you to know that what you've done for this family is the kind of thing we will not forget. My children will not forget it. Robert says to tell Mr. Harrington he's glad the estate is in better hands than it was. I hope you are well, ma'am. You deserve to be." Elizabeth read it twice. She set it down on her desk. She sat very still for a moment with the particular fullness of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been given briefly permission to put it down. Then she picked up her pen and wrote back. The formal legal proceedings against Marcus Webb and the deposed Caldwell began in earnest the following week, and the county, as Alderton had predicted, and as Elizabeth had known, talked about almost nothing else. She heard the range of it through Caroline, who moved through the social landscape with the reporting accuracy of a woman who understood that information was a form of currency and had decided in recent weeks to spend it honestly. Some people said Nathaniel had been manipulated by a woman who didn't understand Virginia ways. Some said the Webb connection was an embarrassment that proper management of the household would have prevented from becoming public. A smaller, but not insignificant number, said it was about time someone looked closely at Marcus Webb's finances. None of it, when it reached Elizabeth, had the power over her that she suspected it was meant to have. She had made her peace in the weeks since the wedding, and the carriage ride, and the small room in the East Wing, with the fact that she would not be universally approved of. That was not the goal. The goal had never been approval. Judge Alderton called her to provide her account of the discovery formally, which she did in his office in Charlottesville on a bright October morning, with Nathaniel beside her and Forsyth attending, and she laid out the sequence of events with the clarity of a woman who had been paying attention to every detail since the first ledger page and knew exactly what she had found and when and what it meant. Alderton listened to all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Harrington, in 30 years on the bench, I have encountered perhaps 4 witnesses whose account of events was this precise. You'll understand if I tell you that 2 of them were attorneys." "I was well educated," Elizabeth said. "My father believed his daughters should be." "Virginia is fortunate that he did," Alderton said. Nathaniel beside her said nothing. But she felt him shift slightly, and when she glanced at him, his eyes were straight ahead, and there was something in his profile that she had not seen there before. Pride. Uncomplicated, genuine pride. Not in himself, in her. She looked away before he could catch her looking. 2 weeks after the formal proceedings began, Eleanor Harrington came to Elizabeth's study in the late afternoon with a piece of paper in her hand and an expression that was the happiest Elizabeth had seen on the older woman's face. "I've found a teacher," she said. Elizabeth looked up. For the school, a young woman from Fredericksburg. She taught in a church school for 3 years before the family she was with moved north. She's looking for a position, and she has excellent references. Eleanor set the paper on the desk. "I wrote to your mother. She made inquiries." Elizabeth looked at the paper. Then she looked at her mother-in-law. "You wrote to my mother." "I did," Eleanor said with the ease of a woman who has decided something and acted on it and is content with both. "She is a sensible woman, and she knows Fredericksburg, and she was very helpful." A pause. "She also said to tell you she is proud of you and that she has stopped worrying quite so much." Elizabeth felt the tightening in her chest that came when something touched a place she kept carefully managed. Her mother. She had written, of course, regularly, faithfully, but the letters could only carry so much, and she had been careful in writing them not to carry too much weight through them, not to worry her mother more than was necessary. Knowing her mother had stopped worrying quite so much, she found more relief than she was prepared for. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. Eleanor sat down across from her. "I want to tell you something," she said. "And I want you to hear it plainly, not as a mother-in-law performing the required sentiments, but as a woman who has lived in this house for 30 years and knows exactly what it is." "All right," Elizabeth said. "When my son proposed this marriage," Eleanor said, "I told him he was making a mistake, not because of your family or your background, but because of his reasons. I knew about the wager. He didn't know I knew, but I did." Her hands were folded in her lap. "I thought it would be a disaster. I thought a woman with any sense would refuse, and I thought if she didn't refuse, she would be diminished by this house within a year." "And now," Elizabeth said. Eleanor looked at her steadily. "Now I think my son made the right choice for entirely the wrong reasons, and that the right result came out of it anyway, which is not how things usually work, and for which I am profoundly grateful." She paused. You have woken this house up, Elizabeth. You have woken my son up, and you have managed to do it without destroying either the house or my son in the process, which is considerably more difficult than it sounds." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. "I haven't done it yet," she said. "The school isn't built. The proceedings aren't finished. The families aren't fully compensated." "No," Eleanor agreed. "But they will be." She said it with simple certainty. "I know what this house looks like when it's running the way it should. I haven't seen it in 12 years. I'm beginning to see it now." They sat in the late afternoon light in the small study that had become Elizabeth's, with the teacher's references on the desk between them and the list of children's names that Margaret Morris had sent last week on the shelf above. And Eleanor Harrington looked at her daughter-in-law with an expression that Elizabeth, who had been careful for so long about what she allowed herself to want, found almost more than she could look at directly. She looked at it anyway. "Tell me about the teacher," she said. "What are her references like?" And they got to work. The school opened on a Monday. It was the second week of November. 4 months and 3 weeks after Elizabeth Carter had removed her wedding gloves at a banquet table and set them down with the deliberate care of a woman, setting down everything she had been expected to be. The building was a converted storage structure on the east edge of the estate, solid, well repaired, with new windows that let in the morning light, and 4 rows of wooden benches that Thomas and 2 of the stable hands had built themselves on 3 successive Saturdays, refusing compensation for the extra work in the particular way of people who understand that some things are worth more than wages. 11 children came on the first morning. Elizabeth counted them from the doorway. 11 children ranging from 6 to 14, scrubbed and serious, and carrying the careful stillness of young people who understand that something important is happening, even if they cannot yet name what it is. Margaret Morris's 3 were among them. 2 Hensley children. A girl named Della, whose father worked the North Fields, and who had walked an hour in the early cold to be there, which Elizabeth learned from Thomas, and did not forget. The teacher, Miss Ruth Carey of Fredericksburg, was 24 years old and had the quality of a woman who had known exactly what she wanted to do with her life since she was about 8 and had been working toward it ever since. She met the children at the door with a directness that did not talk down and did not perform warmth, but simply was warm. And Elizabeth watched from the back of the room for the first 20 minutes before slipping out so as not to distract from what was beginning. She stood outside in the November air and allowed herself to feel it, the fullness of it, the particular weight of something that had been an idea on a veranda 3 months ago and was now 11 children on wooden benches learning to read. Nathaniel found her there. He had come quietly, the way he had learned to come to things he wasn't sure he had the right to attend. He stood beside her and looked at the building and didn't speak for a moment. 11, she said. "I heard," he said. "Thomas told me before I was out of bed." A pause. Della Watkins walked from the North Fields. "I know." He was quiet. Then, "My father would have done this," he said. "He talked about it once when I was young. I thought it was impractical." "Most good things seem impractical before they exist," Elizabeth said. He turned and looked at her with the full attention that had become in recent weeks the thing she most valued and most guarded herself against valuing too openly. "Elizabeth," he said, "I want to say something, and I want to say it correctly, so I need you to let me try, even if the first attempt isn't right." She turned to face him. "I have spent 4 months watching you do things I didn't believe were possible in this house," he said. "I've watched you find what no one else looked for, say what no one else would say, and build trust with people. I had managed through fear for years without understanding what I was losing by doing it." He stopped, tried again. "I came into this marriage intending to prove something, a point, about pride and persuasion and what a man of my standing could accomplish." His jaw tightened. "What I actually accomplished was marrying the one woman in Virginia who was capable of showing me what my standing was actually worth, which turned out to be considerably less than I thought." "Nathaniel, I'm not finished," he said, not harshly, with the particular focus of a man who has rehearsed something in his head many times and is determined to get through it. "I know I cannot undo the wedding. I know I cannot undo the room or the months of performing authority at your expense, or the years of inattention that let Webb and Caldwell operate in this house unchallenged. I cannot undo those things. But I want you to know." He stopped. Something moved through his expression that she had not seen there before, something undefended and very serious. I want you to know that I intend to spend however long it takes making this house into something you are not merely willing to live in. Something you are glad to. The morning air was cold and still between them. Elizabeth looked at her husband. She had been careful these months about the distance she maintained. Not hostile, not punishing, but real. Earned. The distance of a woman who had learned that her own instincts were worth protecting, and that trust was not a door you opened simply because someone knocked. She was still careful. But she heard him. The school is a beginning, she said, not a closing of any account. I want to be clear about that. I know, he said. What happened at our wedding happened, she said. I'm not going to perform forgetting it because enough time has passed or because you've done things that deserve recognition. Both things are true at once. What you did was wrong, and what you've done since has been right. I can hold both of those. I know that too, he said. And I am... She paused, found the words carefully. I am glad to be here. I want you to know that. Not in spite of everything. Not pretending everything was simple, but genuinely presently in this moment, I am glad. He exhaled. It was a small thing, a single breath, but she heard everything in it, the release of something he had been holding since before he could name what he was holding it for. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me, she said. Be worthy of it. He almost smiled. Yes, ma'am, he said, and the old Western courtesy of it landed between them like something newly minted, not performance this time, but genuine. She turned back toward the school building. Inside, she could hear Miss Carey's voice clear and patient, asking a question, and then waiting for an answer with the particular quality of a teacher who understands that the wait is as important as the question. Come on, Elizabeth said. We'll be late for the morning. Late for what? Nathaniel asked. Eleanor is meeting with the Hensleys this morning about the compensation agreement. She wanted us both there. She started walking. She said she didn't want to do the talking herself, but she wanted witnesses who actually understood the numbers. Nathaniel fell into step beside her. My mother is negotiating tenant compensation agreements now, he said. Your mother has been watching this estate for 30 years and waiting for someone to give her something useful to do, Elizabeth said. I gave her something useful to do. The results speak for themselves. They do, he said. And then quietly, she told me last week that she hadn't felt this way about the house since my father was alive. Elizabeth said nothing. But she felt it, the fullness of it, the way it pressed against the careful architecture she maintained around the things that mattered most to her. She kept walking. The legal proceedings concluded in December. Marcus Webb was found liable on 14 counts of financial fraud spanning 11 years. The court ordered full restitution to 7 tenant families, 5 of whom had been on Forsyth's audit list, 2 of whom the audit had subsequently uncovered, plus penalties that would take Webb the better part of a decade to clear. His property was not seized, but his standing in Virginia society was in the particular way of these things quietly and thoroughly dismantled. Men who had called him a friend found reasons not to call at all. Invitations stopped. The broad, easy confidence that had carried him through 30 years of other people's tables evaporated with the efficiency of a thing that had always depended on no one looking too closely. Caldwell received a harsher judgment. He had forged documents in the name of a dead man. The court was not inclined toward mercy, and it did not offer any. Elizabeth was in Alderton's office when the verdicts were read into the formal record. Nathaniel was beside her. Forsyth sat across the table with his ledgers and his careful, undemonstrative satisfaction. Alderton read the document with the gravity of a man who understood that legal proceedings were at their core about something more than numbers, about the formal acknowledgement by the institutions of a society that certain things had happened and that they were wrong. When he finished, he looked up at Elizabeth. Mrs. Harrington, he said, the court wishes to note formally that the identification of the original discrepancy in the estate accounts and the evidence chain that led to this proceeding were the direct result of your examination of those accounts. He paused. That is not standard language for a verdict document, but I believe it is accurate, and I believe accuracy matters. Elizabeth held his gaze. Thank you, Judge. No, he said. Thank you. Robert Morris came to Harrington Crossing the week after Christmas. He came alone on foot, which meant he had walked 2 miles in December cold, and Mrs. Aldridge brought him to the front parlor with the slightly flustered quality of a woman whose sense of household protocol was being gently stretched by the fact that the mistress of the house had made it perfectly clear that tenant farmers were to be shown to the front parlor and not the back door. Elizabeth met him there. Nathaniel, who had been in the study, came when Mrs. Aldridge told him and stood in the doorway for a moment before Elizabeth caught his eye and tilted her head slightly toward the chair beside her. He came and sat down. Robert Morris was a man of about 45, weathered in the way of men who have spent their lives outdoors and working with the careful dignity of someone who has maintained self-respect through circumstances that did not make it easy. He held his hat in his hands, and he looked at them both with the direct, unperformed quality of a man who does not have the social training for performance and has never needed it. "I came to say something," he said. "And I wanted to say it in person, not in a letter, because what I wanted to say is not the kind of thing that fits on paper." "We're glad you came," Elizabeth said. "I've farmed that parcel for 15 years, Robert Morris said. "My father helped clear it. I always thought—" He stopped, collected himself. "I always thought that if you worked hard enough and were honest and kept your word, things would work out right. And then they didn't for years, and I couldn't figure out what I'd done wrong." He looked at Elizabeth directly. "You showed me I hadn't done anything wrong. That's a thing a man needs to know. It's a thing that matters to how he looks at himself." The room was very quiet. "And what you've done, the school, the compensation, the way the estate has been run these past months." He stopped again. "My daughter Susanna is one of Miss Carey's students. She came home last week and read me a passage from a book, out loud. She's 8 years old." His voice had gone rough at the edges. "She read to me. First person in my family who ever could." Elizabeth felt the tightening in her chest that she had learned over the course of these months to simply allow rather than manage away. Some things deserve to be felt. This was one of them. "Mr. Morris," Nathaniel said. His voice was measured and quiet, and had in it the particular quality she had heard developing over the past months, the voice of a man speaking without performance. "I owe your family an apology that I should have made sooner. What was done on this estate under my name and my authority was wrong. The fact that I didn't know about it directly doesn't change that the knowledge was available to me if I had looked. I should have looked." He paused. "I'm sorry." Robert Morris looked at him for a long moment. The look of a man weighing something he has been carrying and deciding how much of it is safe to put down. "I appreciate that," he said. Finally, simply. "The compensation agreement," Nathaniel said, "includes the Northfield parcel that's been sitting fallow. I'd like to offer it to you on the original terms of your father's contract with my grandfather, if you want it." Robert Morris went very still. "The north parcel," he said slowly. That's twice the acreage." "Your family cleared that land too," Nathaniel said. "My grandfather's records show it. You've been farming half what you should have been contracted for." He met the older man's eyes. "That's yours, Mr. Morris. It was always yours." The silence that followed was the kind that contains more than words can hold. Robert Morris put his hat on his knee and looked at it for a moment. When he looked up, he did not try to say everything that was in his expression. I was wise enough to know it wouldn't come out right if he tried. "My wife sent something for you," he said, and reached into his coat and produced a small paper-wrapped parcel that he held out to Elizabeth. "She made it herself. She said you'd know what it was for." Elizabeth unwrapped it. Inside was a small piece of needlework, a simple pattern carefully done, 4 words, stitched in blue thread on white cotton. She paid attention. Elizabeth held it in her hands for a moment. "Tell Mrs. Morris," she said when she trusted her voice, "that I will put this somewhere I can see it." "She'll be glad to hear it," Robert Morris said. He stood, and Nathaniel stood, and they shook hands with the particular quality of men who are beginning something new from the ruins of something old. And then Robert Morris put his hat on and walked back out into the December cold, with 2 miles ahead of him and significantly less weight than he'd come in with. The twist no one had seen coming arrived in January. It came in the form of a letter from Philadelphia, not from an attorney, not from a court, but from a woman named Clara Whitmore, who identified herself as a former associate of Marcus Webb's family business interests in the northern states, and who had, upon reading the account of the Virginia proceedings in the Philadelphia papers, a great deal more to say about Marcus Webb's financial activities than the Virginia court had yet heard. It turned out that Webb's operations in Virginia were not an isolated scheme. They were the southern branch of a network that had been running for 20 years across 4 states, a sophisticated pattern of embedded fraud in estate management that had targeted specifically large landholding families in the years immediately following a patriarch's death. The vulnerability window. The moment when the new inheritor was young and inexperienced and surrounded by advisors who had transferred over from the previous generation. When Forsyth received the Philadelphia documents forwarded through Alderton, who had been in correspondence with his counterpart in Pennsylvania, he came to Harrington Crossing in person. He sat across from Elizabeth with the particular expression of a man whose professional life had prepared him for financial complexity, but not quite for this scale of it. "Mrs. Harrington," he said, "the Virginia proceedings were the first time anyone has successfully prosecuted Webb on the basis of his own account records. The Philadelphia families had suspicions, but couldn't build the evidentiary chain. You built the evidentiary chain." "I looked at the numbers," Elizabeth said. "You looked at the numbers in a way that produced a result that is now being used in 4 separate legal proceedings across the eastern states," Forsyth said. He set a second document on the desk. "I have been asked by the attorneys in Pennsylvania, New York, and Maryland whether you would be willing to consult on the account structures in those cases, formally, as an expert in the pattern." Elizabeth stared at him. Nathaniel, sitting beside her, said nothing, but she felt him turn to look at her. "I'm not an attorney," she said. "No," Forsyth said. "But you are the person who broke the pattern, and the pattern is what every one of those cases turns on." He paused. "There would be compensation, of course, and it would not require you to travel correspondence and document review primarily, with the possibility of a formal consultation in Philadelphia in the spring, if you were willing." Elizabeth looked at the document. She looked at Nathaniel. She looked back at Forsyth. "I'll need to review the account structures for each case before I can tell you whether my analysis would be useful," she said. "If you send me the relevant ledgers, I'll give you an answer within 2 weeks." Forsyth nodded with the compressed satisfaction of a man who had expected to have to argue longer. "I thought you might say that," he said. "I took the liberty of bringing the first set with me." He produced a leather case from beside his chair and set it on the desk. Elizabeth looked at it. Then she looked at her husband. Nathaniel was watching her with the expression she had first seen in its most nascent form on the morning of Forsyth's original letter. The uncomplicated, genuine pride of a man who has finally learned to recognize something worth being proud of that has nothing to do with himself. "You're going to need a larger desk," he said. She almost laughed. It came out as something close to it, a real sound, unguarded, the kind she had been careful with for months. "Yes," she said. "I am." She pulled the leather case toward her and opened it. Spring came to Harrington Crossing with the particular generosity of Virginia springs, warm and sudden and full of the evidence that things had been growing underground all winter in ways that weren't visible until they weren't underground anymore. The school had grown to 19 students by March. Miss Carey had written to a colleague in Richmond about the curriculum, and the colleague had written back with materials and a suggestion for a second teacher by fall. Eleanor Harrington had taken over the scheduling of the school's calendar with the organized precision of a woman who had been waiting for 30 years for something this important to schedule, and she attended twice a week herself, not to teach, but to be there, which Elizabeth had come to understand was its own form of statement about what the House of Harrington considered worth its attention. The Philadelphia consultation had produced a result in February that had sent letters of thanks from attorneys in 3 states, and more usefully, a request from the Pennsylvania court for Elizabeth's written analysis of the Webb account pattern to be entered into the formal record as expert documentation. She had spent 6 weeks on it, working in the study that now had a larger desk and 2 additional shelves, with Nathaniel bringing her coffee on the evenings when she worked late and not asking when she would be finished, which she had come to recognize as his specific form of support, the giving of space without the withdrawal of presence. She had submitted the analysis in March. The Pennsylvania verdict came in April. Alderton brought the news himself, which told her it was good before he said a word. He stood in the front parlor and told them both that Marcus Webb's Philadelphia assets had been ordered frozen pending further proceedings in New York and Maryland, and that the combined restitution ordered across all 4 states would by conservative estimate return to affected families a sum that made the Virginia proceedings look like a preliminary inquiry. 20 years, Alderton said. He operated for 20 years. You found him in 9 weeks. I found the Virginia piece in 9 weeks, Elizabeth said. The rest of it was other people building on what that produced. That is how it always works, Alderton said. Someone has to be first. She walked him to this door when he left, and stood on the front step in the April morning and thought about February. Not this February, but the February before the wedding. When her father's business partner had sat across from her in a quiet room and told her with the guilty relief of a man who cannot carry something alone anymore what had been said at Marcus Webb's card table. She had sat with that information for 6 weeks before the wedding. She had thought about it the way she thought about all things that required careful thought. She had decided in the end that the wager told her something about who Nathaniel Harrington was performing for the world, and that what she had seen in 4 months of courtship told her something different about who he was underneath the performance, and that the distance between those two things was either unbridgeable or the most interesting problem she had ever been given to work on. She had chosen the problem. Standing on the step in the April sun, she did not regret it. Nathaniel found her there, the way he often found her in these months, not by seeking specifically, but by moving through the house with the new attentiveness of a man who has learned to pay attention and discovers having learned it how much there is to attend to. He stood beside her. They looked at the drive, at the fields past it, at the estate that had been in his family for 4 generations, and that looked this spring subtly different than it had any spring he could remember. Not in any single visible thing, in the quality of it, in the way it felt to stand in it. Forsyth sent his quarterly, he said. The accounts are clean. First time he can say that with certainty about any quarter in the record he's examined. Good, she said. The north parcel Morris is working is up 40% from last year's yield. Margaret told me, she said. Susanna read her the figures. He almost smiled. The almost smile had become over these months one of her private catalogued things, the way it arrived just before the real one, the moment of a man deciding that something was worth letting through his defenses. The real one followed. Small. Real. She looked at him. I want to ask you something, he said. Ask it, she said. The ballroom, he said. I want to use it, not for a dinner party, not for anything like before. He paused. I want to invite the estate families. The Morrises, the Hensleys, everyone on Forsyth's list, and everyone who wasn't on it, but who works this land. I want to have them in the main house in the ballroom with the good silver out and the food from our kitchen, and I want to stand in front of them and... He stopped. I want to say what I should have said a year ago, before any of this, about what this estate owes the people who make it work. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. That's not a small thing, she said. No, he said. It isn't. Some of your social circle will think it's extraordinary, not in a complimentary way. I know. You'll do it anyway, she said. I will do it anyway, he said. And the certainty in it had none of the performed authority she had catalogued in their early weeks. It had the quality of a man who has found his footing on different ground and knows it. She looked at her husband in the April morning. She thought about the woman who had removed her gloves at a banquet table and set them down with the precision of a woman setting down everything she had been expected to be. She thought about what that woman had walked into, and what she had found inside it, and what she had built from what she found. Yes, she said. Let's do it. The gathering was held on the first Saturday of May. 37 people came into Harrington Crossing's ballroom, the same ballroom where 200 guests had laughed at a bride's expense a year before. The same silver was out. The same kitchen had produced the food. But the room was entirely different, because the people in it were different, and the reason they had been invited was different, and what was said was different. Nathaniel stood before them. How was not performing? That was the first thing Elizabeth noted watching from beside Eleanor, who stood with her back very straight and her eyes very bright. He was not working the room, not projecting confidence, not managing impressions. He simply stood before 37 people who worked his land and looked at them. "A year ago," he said, "this house was not run the way it should have been. Not because of what was done by the men who stole from it, though they will answer for that, and have begun to. But because of what was done by me. The inattention. The assumption that authority and respect were the same thing, and that a man who had inherited land had somehow earned the trust of the people on it." He paused. "I had not earned it. I am working on earning it." The room was absolutely still. "What has happened in this estate over the past year is not something I can claim," he said. "I can claim that I acted on it when it was brought to me. I cannot claim that I found it." He looked at Elizabeth directly. "My wife found it. She found it because she came into this house and looked at it honestly, without the assumptions I had spent my whole life accumulating. She sat at your kitchen tables. She read the ledgers no one had cross-referenced in 12 years. She told the truth in rooms where telling the truth was not comfortable." His voice was steady and without decoration. "This estate is what it is becoming because of her. I want you to know that. And I want her to hear me say it out loud in this room in front of people who know what it cost her." 37 people turned and looked at Elizabeth. Margaret Morris was crying quietly. Robert Morris was not, but his jaw was set with the particular tension of a man keeping himself together through deliberate effort. Thomas, standing near the back, caught her eye and gave her the small nod of a young man who has witnessed the full arc of a year and knows its value. Eleanor Harrington reached over and took Elizabeth's hand without looking at her. Elizabeth stood in the room where she had been humiliated 1 year before, with the needlework that said she paid attention. Framed on the study wall upstairs, with 11 children, grown to 19, and a desk full of ledgers from 4 states, and a husband standing at the front of his ancestral ballroom, telling the truth about her out loud. And she felt the fullness of it press against every carefully managed boundary she had built, and she let it. She had not come to Harrington Crossing to be loved. She had come because she believed a difficult thing was worth attempting, and she had attempted it without the guarantee of any particular outcome, because that was what belief required. She had not expected this, but she was not, she found, unwilling to receive it. Nathaniel crossed the room to her. He stood before her and offered his hand the way a man offers his hand to a woman. He is asking for something, not her obedience, not her performance, but her actual present chosen company. She looked at him. "You still have a long way to go," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm still watching. I'm counting on it," he said. The same words he had said on the veranda in summer, and they meant more, now more specifically, more honestly, more truly earned by the distance they had both traveled to reach this moment. She took his hand, not because the story was finished, not because the pain was gone, or the past was rewritten, or the distance between who he had been and who she needed him to be had been fully closed. She took his hand because she was a woman who had learned to measure the distance remaining rather than mourn the distance already crossed, and because the man standing before her had spent 1 year becoming someone who deserved to stand there. That was enough. That was, in the end, everything. Elizabeth Carter. Harrington stood in the ballroom of the house she had chosen and built, and refused to be diminished by, with her husband's hand in hers, and 37 witnesses to the truth of what it had cost and what it had made, and she knew with the bone-deep certainty of a woman who had never been wrong about the things that mattered most that the life she was standing inside was not the life she had been given. It was the life she had made, and it was entirely, irrevocably, magnificently hers.